Good morning, everybody. I guess we're now in the home stretch of CIS, the final track before the main part of the conference concludes. Everybody having a good time? Has everybody had a good CIS? A little round of applause for Ping for arranging something. Thank you. I have had a great time. So this morning, I'm going to get in a little bit deeper on what Eric talked about in his keynote around identifier-first. So Eric is my boss, and I am used to dealing with him, and I know from experience that he is, if nothing else, a fire hose of information that comes down at you. So hopefully I will be able to dig in a little bit deeper on identifier-first, and I promise repetition does not spoil the prayer. So as Eric pointed out, Google's login flow has changed. We have spent the last 9 months or so working on going across our different platforms and changing what the login flow looks like for all of our users. So first, last fall, we did it on Android. We did a complete makeover on the Android, going to material design and all of that good stuff. But one of the other features around it was losing the password box. And we've recently did this on iOS as well, and on web. So the big question is now, what happens? What is up with this flow of separating the username entry part to the password? It seems very unconventional. So how is this going? How has this worked out for us, separating the username and password field? Well, in general, it's gone pretty well, but there are always a few bumps in the road. So I went into our Gmail user forum where we did a short post announcing that we'd been making this change to our login flow, and as is often the case in user forums, you get the most voluble and upset people that have a good place to vent. So this was, one of the kind of cuter responses from one of our users. But I think the point here is, as Bob has been pointed out in his keynote, we have this login system that has been challenging users all the time. And there is a lot of muscle memory associated with that. Multiple times a day, username, password, username, password, username, password. And when you disrupt the flow a little bit, that becomes awkward. So you have to go through a little retraining process as you go into this identifier-first mode. So what are we trying to do here? We're obviously not trying to frustrate our users and just have a little bit more friction in the user process. So when we went through this process, TechCrunch picked up on it, and they pretty much hit the nail on the head of what we're trying to do. So it's pretty self-evident that if your login form always has a password box, you can't get rid of the password. It's just self-effacing that way. So in order to make progress moving towards no longer requiring a password from users, we have to break up this login ceremony that we're also familiar with of including the username and password together. So some of the benefits that we've gotten immediately from breaking up the username and password is for our corporate customers that use federation. So we have at Google, for our enterprise customers, long supported SAML for those enterprise customers that want to be their own IDP, want to own the authentication dance with their own users. And so for them, it has always, our old login with the username and password has actually been very broken. Because as Eric pointed out, Google has actually been phishing our corporate customers' credentials. Because what most workers for those enterprises would do is they would want to gain access to their email. They would go to Google. Google would challenge them with an email and password, and they would think, okay, I type in my corporate email password into this box. Of course I would. What else would a user expect to do? But the corporation has decided that they want to own the authentication dance and to use SAML to do that. So those credentials were getting submitted into Google, and of course we didn't record those or do anything with those corporate credentials. But it was innately confusing experience and a bad security situation for our enterprise customers. So when we have identifier-first, now we can simply redirect to the SAML endpoint for that enterprise user and have a much cleaner experience. We can also begin to do this with other federation for consumer-based IDPs. So the vast majority of Google accounts have an @gmail.com address associated with them, but we still have millions and millions of accounts with Yahoo and Hotmail and Outlook and other email IDPs. So those other email providers do generally support some form of federation. And so with identifier-first, that also enables us to get rid of passwords for that class of users that wants to continue using their Yahoo Mail account. So what we're really looking forward from an ecosystem perspective is for all of these other identity providers to support what Eric talked about briefly in the keynote, is fast ID verification. So that would be, since the user is telling us that I want to log in with aloungeway@yahoo.com, that's the user's intent to use that email address, to pass that as a hint when we authenticate with Yahoo and have Yahoo just do this. You know, is that user here? Yep or no. And then if that user is there, then we can complete the login simply and seamlessly for the user. Device-based authentication. This is what we're all really excited about and what we're gunning for. So we're already, you know, in the process of developing technology that we hope to launch later this year, where when you, say, are on a desktop computer and you want to begin to log in to Google, and you also happen to have a device that has appropriately registered itself with Google, when you do that identifier first, when you give that Gmail address that you want to log into on the desktop, instead of going to challenge you for a password, we will send a message to your phone. And this is not just like an SMS kind of message. This is an interactive experience on the mobile device where you just say, yes, I want to log in on that desktop in La Jolla, California, and that will seamlessly log the desktop in. So we've gotten LookMa, no hands, we've gotten rid of the password completely in that case. So that's the direction that we're driving towards. And there's been a lot of discussion around FIDO at the conference, and FIDO actually makes the login dance even more complicated, because now you have to think about which FIDO methods have been registered on the server side to be able to authenticate the user, what is the capability of a particular device. It's actually really complicated to understand exactly how you should challenge the user when you've got multiple devices, multiple authentication methods that could be used. And so one of the key components of actually delivering a reasonable user experience, you certainly don't want to have the user have to go through a matrix of different device tapes, authenticators, et cetera, to figure out how they should be logging in. But when you go to identifier first, you're then able to provide one critical component to that decision of what you should be challenging it with. The other is what is available on the device. So when you bring those two things together, then server side you can decide, okay, on this device for this user, I should be challenging this way. Maybe it's through another remote device like I just demonstrated, or something that is resident locally on that device. And another fantastic aspect of doing identifier first is that experience that I've certainly had, and I think most people have, of when you come to a site and you're not exactly, you've used it before, you don't know exactly whether or not you signed up before, you're kind of in that, what should I do here zone. With identifier first, the service provider can actually figure out whether you have an account on that site and then provide the appropriate interface for it. So if there's no account, then send them directly to the sign-up form. If there is an account, then figure out how you need to authenticate them and go straight to that instead of making the user figure out exactly what they need to do. All right, so that's the benefits that we have experienced in moving towards identifier first and the direction that we're going in to improve user experience and improve security. If you want to start moving in the direction of identifier first, here's some best practices. So the first is using an account chooser. So on the web, there is AccountChooser.com, and as Eric also mentioned in the keynote, there is Smart Lock for Passwords, which we just recently announced a couple of weeks ago on the Android platform. So one of the things that you should do when you're moving towards using an account chooser and doing identifier first is this account status endpoint. So this is really where you can drive a lot of the magic of what the user experience is. So essentially what that is once on the client side, the user selects an identity that they intend to log in as, that their goal to arrive into that account is, the client will then take that identity and hit an endpoint that you put on the server, where you can then look up in your server-side user database how that user typically authenticates. So in this case, when nickcorlett@gmail.com wants to log into this site, there's a lookup that returns that user authenticates with the Google IDP. And then once that information comes back, then you customize what the login experience is from then forward, and you reduce the complexity of all of the login options that the user can have. Now, it's important to know there's often a lot of people say, is there a security concern for that? If I have an endpoint that allows me to discover whether or not an account exists, can't somebody, harvest my whole account database? If you don't protect that API, then yes, that's true. So you will need to do a little work to harden that API to look for harvesters to ensure that your user database is protected. All right, the benefit that I explained that we have in terms of disambiguating between new and existing users, you can take advantage of that as well. So here is the basic logic diagram here. After you get that result back from the user status endpoint, you can determine if it's a new user or not. If it is, then you can send them through the sign-up flow. So in this case, it would be offering the user a bunch of IDPs that they can sign up with, or to create a username and password. If they choose the option of creating a username and password, then all of the information that was passed through the account chooser, and that would be, you see the name, the email address, and the profile photo, those are often the most important pieces of information that are required to register a user. And you get past that automatically when you work with either AccountChooser.com or Smart Lock for Passwords. So that enables you to pre-populate the registration form with those values. And so all that the user needs to do then is select a password, and if they're on a device that has integration with the password manager, then that is usually a one-tap operation as well. So you've actually radically simplified your registration process for users that have passwords. Now, for those that already have an account, then you just need to determine whether or not you need to challenge that user for their password, or they use an identity provider, and if they use an identity provider, you just send them on their merry way. And there are some further optimizations you can do to this kind of logic tree. If you don't want to support social identity providers, and you're really just accepting email-based identity providers or corporate IDPs, you can do the logic tree, but you can change the logic tree by having the SSO question come first. So regardless of whether it's a new or existing user, if you can authenticate that user with an IDP, say because they have an @gmail.com or an @Yahoo account, you know who those IDPs are, and you can immediately redirect that user to that IDP, whether they're a new or an existing user. And if they are if they are not an IDP user, then you go through the same new user to either sign up form for a password or to challenge them for their password. All right, so on the Android platform, what should you do if you want to start incorporating identifier first and using an account chooser? So again, we launched this just a couple of weeks ago, and Smart Lock for Passwords is not just an account chooser, it is also a password manager built into the Android platform. So that has the ability to really streamline your login flow as the user tries to access their account from multiple devices. It works across Chrome and Android together. So from an API perspective, it's pretty simple. It's a basic read and write API. So you simply call the Smart Lock API, and one of three things can happen. Either a credential gets returned because in a previous session, the user has saved their username and password into Smart Lock for Password, either on Chrome or on Android. And if you get that credential back, you're on the happy path, and you just log the user in, and they never had to touch anything, which is fantastic. There's a corner case. They may have multiple credentials, in which case they have to choose. That's that middle path. And then there's the case where nothing does happen to be stored for the user. And so what we offer instead of providing a credential is the account chooser experience. So you can surface that to the user, and whichever identity they select, you'll get all the information associated with it. On the web, there is AccountChooser.com. This has been around for several years, and AccountChooser.com has fantastic privacy properties. So this was designed from the very beginning to be a client-side only solution. There is no big pot of gold out there on the internet for attackers to hack, to understand all the different identities and correlate those identities and accounts together. Doesn't exist. Everything is client-side based. So if you want to get more info, you can go to accountchooser.net to learn how to integrate that in. But the quick summary for how to integrate with accountchooser.com is simply you include a JavaScript little servlet inside or applet inside your HTML. And as the user goes through the login process, you redirect that user to AccountChooser.com where they select the identity that they want to use, and then that comes back to your site, and you're able to post that to your account status endpoint and go and do all of the login optimizations that I just went through. On iOS, the story is not quite as good. Apple does not have any sort of native account chooser on the iOS platform. We've talked to them about that, and they're always a little bit difficult to read in terms of what their future plans are. But one positive sign is that on Apple TV, there is a native account chooser. They realize that typing your email address on a D-pad is a hellacious experience, and so they remember all of the different email addresses that you have typed to get into the various services on your Apple TV. So that is an encouraging sign that Apple recognizes some value in the account chooser. But it's easy for you to basically roll your own, where you simply on the main page here separate the username from password and go from there. One other thing to think about, particularly in the enterprise context, is for many services there are multiple tenants. So Salesforce, for instance, or Workday, there might be multiple departments that have instances of those applications. And so there is a given user may actually need to disambiguate which of those instances they want to try to log into. An identifier-first flow can help with that too. So right now with the Tenant Discovery, you basically have to train the user to go to some vanity URL and to understand the difference. It's a sort of cryptic thing. If you don't get it right, then you're frustrated about how to actually log in. With an identifier-first flow, you can again do this same thing, where you can look up and see where could this user be going, and then present that user with the appropriate tenants that they then would want to log into. All right, in terms of some of the technical complexities of moving to an identifier-first flow, particularly on the web, some things to watch out for. So password managers is one of those things. So you don't want to frustrate your users by confusing their password manager that they've decided to offload their brain from all of the complexities of login and hand that over to their password manager. When their password manager doesn't work, that is a bad experience. So it definitely pays to ensure that that happens. So you want to make sure that your DOM is set up correctly. And then the other thing is, while identifier-first breaks into 2 pages, the assertion of the username and then the challenge, the password challenge in the case of a password login, you'll want to actually have both fields on both pages, but you just want to have one of the fields hidden in both cases, alternate fields. So hide the password on the identifier assertion and hide the identifier on the password challenge page. And you'll want to make sure that you're keeping track of whether or not the user is editing any of these things, because that can actually also foul up some password managers. All right, so what does this mean for all of you? What should you be doing related to identifier first? So it depends a little bit on who you are, but if you're an IDP or an application provider, again, it sort of has all of these benefits. It enables you to move forward in your authentication, to provide stronger and better methods of authentication beyond the password, to get rid of that toxic waste that you don't really want to be responsible for, and it provides a simplified UX for your users. A couple of things that you'll want to think about before you move forward with this. One is the Xanderpants issue, where this isn't necessarily familiar to a lot of users, so you'll want to be ready to train them and be patient with them as you move towards an identifier-first model. But we're doing a lot. We have, you can always point, hey, Google is doing that. It can't be so wrong. And hopefully we will start training users to expect a little bit different experience through the login ceremony going forward. And then the other kind of issue is for applications that support non-email IDPs, namely Facebook. So Facebook, you have your email address typically registered with Facebook, and Facebook asserts your @gmail.com email address, but they're not the authority for Gmail. So that can, users typically think about their Facebook not necessarily with the backing identity, their backing email identity for it. So the UX for users that are expecting to use a social IDP sometimes is not ideal. So you'll have to think through that as well. And for enterprises, really you'll want to work with your vendors and to obviously encourage them to move forward and go into the world beyond passwords, and suggest that identifier first is a key way to get there. For your internal applications, you can also implement AccountChooser and SmartLock for passwords to improve the experience for your users. So that's all I've got today. Does anybody have any questions?
With SmartLock on Android, there seems to be a good assumption that the user knows how to secure that device, right? That they, at the very least, just do the lock on the device. Or is there a way for the SmartLock to actually force the user to set the PIN code?
At this point, we do not force the user to necessarily secure the device. The reality of the situation is that all of the accounts that you would save your password for in SmartLock, you can also recover all of those accounts through an email recovery flow. So if you're not securing your device, you are still vulnerable to attack across any of those services through an email recovery flow. We do definitely suggest that users do put a lock screen on their devices, and we at Google, for the Android platform, are investing heavily in reducing the friction and increasing the confidence around screen locks. It's a big tax to have people unlock, but that's one of the reasons why I wear this watch, is because when these two things are together, I don't need a lock screen, or it removes the barrier of the lock screen.
So I have a question for you, because I have the mic. How come you chose SmartLock as the name for the native account chooser, which is totally conflated with the other thing that is SmartLock on the device, which is to do with pairing your Bluetooth device to unlock your phone? It did have a separate name at one point in time.
It had an internal name. No,
but-
never
But
had a separate
it's
name.
perhaps confusing to consumers. Is there some sort of strategy that will help people, or?
Yeah, there is. There has been not a small amount of internal debate about exactly this topic. But the idea here is that really we do want to bring this stronger, we want to both raise the bar and raise the level of security for users, make them more secure, while at the same time lowering the friction for them to be able to get at their stuff. So this is sort of what Bob Blakely was talking about. That is our goal as well. Now, that isn't like one thing. That is many different things that needs to happen in order to deliver that kind of experience. So we wanted to have a name for that sort of experience, and so that's what SmartLock is. It is an umbrella of features, of security features that both increase the security for the user and increase the convenience at the same time.
Especially for Google for Business, is there a way to opt out of identifier-first?
No.
Because, I mean, one. Okay. Next question. I mean, I think one big issue you talked about a little bit is, with a single email address, you can enumerate all their accounts, and
no, so we do, as I mentioned, it's important to protect the endpoint that does this
well, I mean,
discovery.
it's just a web page, right? You can go there and enter an email address and get the account chooser screen.
Yes, but there is a lot of stuff going on underneath that, rate limits, that provides caps on the number of requests you can make, that looks for previous sessions that you've had on that machine. So we've actually invested a lot to try to make that very protected for enterprises and our own domains. So we've actually worked very hard at that.
Okay.
Other questions?
On the flow where someone chose to register as opposed to using an existing account, you said that information gets pre-populated over, but in the event where they've got multiple accounts to choose from, how are you deciding what account to pre-populate their information for a new registration?
The user is telling us what their intent to log in as. So they're saying, I want to log into Google with this email address. And so we're simply pre-populating the information that comes from the account chooser, which is the email address, the name, and the profile picture. If any or all three of those are stored in the account chooser and passed to us, then we will pre-populate based on that information. But it's selected by the user.
Okay, that's it for time.